Lyanna Evercrest had worked inside the Alpha King's palace for nearly 5 years. Most people barely noticed her. That wasn't because she lacked importance. It was because she was always there. When servants lost important documents, they went to Lyanna. When departments argued over schedules, they went to Lyanna. When nobles demanded records from years earlier, somehow Lyanna already had them waiting. Problems entered her office. Solutions left it. The palace depended on her far more than anyone realized, including Lyanna herself. On a typical morning, she arrived before sunrise. While most of the palace still slept, she reviewed correspondence, organized reports, and prepared schedules for the day ahead. By breakfast, she had already solved problems most people never knew existed. A frantic servant appeared at her office door shortly before noon. "Lady Lyanna, we have an issue." She looked up calmly. "What kind?" "The banquet department and kitchen staff are arguing again." Lyanna suppressed a sigh. It was the same dispute they had every few months. She opened a cabinet, removed a folder, and handed it over. "Give this to both department heads." The servant blinked. "What is it?" "Previous agreements they both signed." Relief immediately crossed his face. "Thank you." Minutes later, the crisis was over. Just another ordinary day. Later that afternoon, Lyanna crossed paths with Alpha King Kaelor Draven outside the council wing. He carried several reports beneath one arm. "Your Majesty." "Lyanna." The greeting lasted only a moment before they continued walking. That was normal. For years, most of their interactions had been brief and professional. Kaelor trusted her work. Everyone did. Whenever something important needed handling, it somehow ended up on Lyanna's desk. As evening approached, another advisor hurried into her office, carrying a stack of documents. "Please tell me you're still here." Lyanna smiled faintly. "Barely." The advisor visibly relaxed. The Eastern delegates changed their arrival schedule again. Of course they did. She accepted the papers and began working immediately. The advisor shook his head. "I don't know what we'd do without you." Neither did she, because nobody had ever imagined the palace without Lyanna Evercrest. Not the servants, not the advisors, not even the Alpha King. Everyone simply assumed she would always be there, always fixing problems, always carrying responsibilities, always making life easier for everyone else. And that assumption was about to become the kingdom's biggest mistake. The diplomatic gathering took weeks to prepare. Delegations from across the kingdom arrived at the palace, bringing nobles, advisors, merchants, and political expectations. As always, Lyanna handled the details: guest accommodations, meeting schedules, security clearances, correspondence. Every piece fit together, because she made sure it did. By the time the event began, everything ran flawlessly. No delays, no confusion, no complaints. The nobles praised the palace's efficiency. The council congratulated itself, and Lyanna quietly moved on to the next task. Near midnight, she carried several finalized documents toward the royal strategy room. Most of the palace had gone quiet. Only a few lights remained visible beneath closed doors. As she approached the chamber, voices drifted into the hallway. The door stood slightly open. She immediately recognized one voice: Alpha King Kaelor Draven. The others belonged to visiting nobles. A foreign lord laughed loudly. "I'm amazed you still aren't married, Your Majesty." Another noble joined in. "Half the kingdom wants their daughters on your throne." Several men chuckled. Lyanna barely paid attention. She intended to deliver the documents and continue working. Then another voice spoke. "What about that woman everyone talks about?" The conversation shifted. "What woman?" someone asked. "The archive keeper." More laughter followed. Lyanna slowed her steps. A noble smirked. "Half the court thinks she's secretly in love with the king." The men found that amusing. Lyanna did not. Not because it was true, because palace gossip had always been exhausting. She waited for the conversation to move on. Instead, another question followed. Who is she, anyway? The answer came immediately, without hesitation, without thought. Kaylor's voice remained calm. Nobody important. Silence. The nobles continued talking. Someone changed the subject. Another joke followed. The conversation moved forward naturally. Inside the room, nothing had happened. Outside the room, everything had. Leanna stood perfectly still. The documents in her hands suddenly felt heavier. 5 years, 5 years of service, 5 years of solving problems, 5 years of making the palace function smoothly. And when someone asked who she was, that was the answer. Nobody important. The words echoed through her mind. Not because they were cruel. Cruelty would have been easier. Cruelty required intention. This had been casual, effortless, honest. That was what hurt. No anger rose inside her. No tears. Just a strange emptiness. As though something she had believed for years had quietly broken. Leanna looked down at the documents, then back toward the partially open door. No one inside knew she was there. No one knew she had heard. Slowly, she turned around. The papers remained undelivered in her hands. For the first time since arriving at the palace, Leanna walked away from a responsibility, and as she disappeared down the corridor, only one thought remained. Nobody important. Maybe it was finally time to stop proving otherwise. Leanna did not sleep that night. She sat alone inside her office long after the palace had gone silent. The words replayed endlessly in her mind. Nobody important. Not spoken with hatred, not meant to wound. Simply stated as fact. That was what made them impossible to ignore. For years, Leanna had told herself she was content. She didn't need recognition. She didn't need praise. She didn't need attention. As long as the kingdom prospered, her work mattered, or so she had believed. Now, sitting alone beneath a flickering lamp, she found herself asking a question she had avoided for years. When had everyone else's needs become more important than her own? The answer came too quickly. The day she stopped expecting anything in return. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. One of the younger servants peeked through the doorway. "Lady Leanna, you're still working?" Leanna offered a small smile. "For a little while longer." The servant stepped inside. "I wanted to thank you." Leanna blinked. "For what?" "For helping me when I first arrived." The girl looked embarrassed. "I was terrified. You stayed after your shift to teach me everything." Leanna barely remembered it. To her, it had been a small kindness. To someone else, it had mattered. After the servant left, Leanna sat quietly for several minutes. Then she opened a drawer. Inside were dozens of notebooks, schedules, emergency procedures, instructions, solutions, everything required to keep the palace running. One by one, she organized them into neat stacks. If she left, someone would need them. By dawn, her office looked different, cleaner, final. She prepared detailed handover notes for every department, archive management, council correspondence, diplomatic records, trade agreements. Nothing was left unfinished. Then she pulled out a single sheet of paper. The resignation letter took less than a minute to write. No explanations, no accusations, no emotional farewell. Only one sentence. "Effective immediately, I resign all royal duties." Leanna folded the letter carefully and placed it on her desk. For a long moment, she stared at it. 5 years reduced to a single page. Strangely, she felt lighter, not happy, not angry, free. As the first rays of sunlight touched the palace windows, Leanna collected a small travel bag. There wasn't much to pack. Most of her life had belonged to the palace. Perhaps that was part of the problem. She took one final look around the office. The shelves, the records, the desk where she had spent countless hours solving other people's problems. Then she walked out. No farewell, no announcement, no audience, just quiet footsteps disappearing into the morning. Behind her, the palace continued waking for another ordinary day. Servants prepared breakfast. Advisors reviewed reports. The Alpha King began his morning meetings. None of them realized that the woman holding everything together had already left, and very soon they would discover exactly what her absence meant. The first problem appeared 3 days later. A trade delegation from the Eastern Territories arrived at the palace, gates expecting reserved accommodations. None existed. The servants scrambled frantically, while exhausted travelers waited in the courtyard. Everyone blamed a scheduling error. The issue was eventually fixed. Barely. The second problem arrived the next morning. 2 council meetings had been scheduled for the same chamber at the same time. Half the advisors waited in one room. The other half waited somewhere else. An hour passed before anyone realized the mistake. Tempers flared. Accusations followed. Again, people assumed it was an isolated incident. Then came the third problem, and the fourth, and the fifth. Military reports disappeared into the wrong departments. Messages arrived late. Diplomatic correspondence went unanswered. Important records could not be located. The palace, once known for efficiency, suddenly felt disorganized. By the end of the week, everyone was frustrated, including Alpha King Kaelor Draven. A minister stormed into the throne room carrying a stack of papers. "My king, we have a serious problem." Kaelor barely looked up. "Then solve it." "We've been trying." The minister dropped the documents onto a nearby table. "Nothing is where it's supposed to be." Kaelor frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means schedules are failing, reports are missing, and nobody knows who's responsible for half the administrative work." That finally earned his attention. The king set aside his paperwork. "Find whoever is responsible." The minister hesitated. "That's the problem." "What problem?" The man exhaled slowly. "Lyanna was responsible." Silence. For a moment, Kaelor simply stared. Then he frowned again. "One archive keeper cannot cause this much disruption." The minister laughed. Not because anything was funny, because he was tired. "My king, with respect, she wasn't just an archive keeper." Before Kaelor could respond, another advisor entered the chamber. "Urgently. The Eastern Alliance requires clarification on a treaty clause." Kaelor rubbed his temples. "Then provide it." "We can't." "Why not?" The advisor exchanged a glance with the minister. "Lyanna handled those records." More silence. Uncomfortable this time. Kaelor suddenly found himself hearing the same name over and over. Lyanna. Lyanna organized this. Lyanna managed that. Lyanna handled those issues. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Later that evening, Kaelor reviewed a list of unresolved problems. The stack was unusually large, far larger than normal. His eyes narrowed. For years, these issues had rarely reached his desk. Now, they were everywhere. The realization came slowly, not because the evidence was unclear, because he had never needed to consider it before. The palace wasn't struggling because a single employee had left. The palace was struggling because one woman had quietly been preventing these problems for years, and nobody, including him, had noticed how much she carried until she was gone. By the second week, the palace had stopped pretending everything was under control. Every department felt the strain. Servants worked overtime, correcting mistakes. Advisors argued over responsibilities. Council members complained daily. And somehow, every conversation eventually returned to the same person, Lyanna Evercrest, the woman nobody could replace. Kaelor sat in his study late one evening, reviewing yet another report filled with delays and administrative failures. His patience was wearing thin. A knock sounded at the door. "Enter." The head steward stepped inside carrying a sealed envelope. "My king." Kaylor looked up. "What is it?" The steward placed the envelope on the desk. "We found this in Lady Lyanna's office." Kaylor frowned slightly. The seal had already been broken. The letter inside was surprisingly short. He unfolded it and read the contents. "Effective immediately. I resign all royal duties. Nothing else. No explanation. No complaint. No request. Just a resignation." Kaylor stared at the page. "That's all?" The steward nodded. "Yes, Your Majesty. No emotional farewell. No dramatic accusations. No demands for recognition." The simplicity unsettled him more than anger would have. Most people wanted to be heard when they left. Lyanna hadn't even bothered, as though she no longer expected anyone to listen. The steward hesitated before speaking again. "There was something else." "What?" "We found detailed instructions for every department." Kaylor looked up. "What do you mean?" The steward handed him another folder. Inside were dozens of organized notes, emergency procedures, scheduling guides, archive systems, contingency plans, solutions for problems Kaylor had never even known existed. Page after page, documented responsibilities Lyanna had quietly managed herself. His expression slowly changed. The deeper he read, the worse it became. There were records of diplomatic disputes resolved before reaching the council. Trade complications fixed before merchants complained. Scheduling conflicts prevented weeks in advance. Entire crises erased before anyone noticed. And nowhere in the documents did Lyanna take credit. She simply solved the problem and moved on. Kaylor closed the folder. For the first time since her departure, something uncomfortable settled in his chest. Not frustration, not irritation, guilt. The steward remained silent. Finally, Kaylor asked, "Did anyone know she handled all of this?" The older man considered the question. "Some of us did." "And nobody said anything?" The steward met his gaze carefully. "We assumed you already knew." Silence followed, because the truth was obvious. Kaylor hadn't known. Not really. He had trusted Lyanna's competence so completely that he stopped noticing the effort behind it, stopped asking questions, stopped paying attention. Outside the study windows, darkness covered the palace grounds. Inside, the Alpha King stared at the resignation letter once more. Such a small piece of paper, yet somehow it felt heavier than any report on his desk. For the first time, Kaylor found himself wondering where Lyanna had gone, and why the thought bothered him as much as it did. 3 days after reading the resignation letter, Kaylor gave an order that surprised the entire palace. "Find her." The command spread quickly through the royal guard. Messengers were dispatched across neighboring territories. Travel records were examined. Merchants were questioned. Innkeepers were interviewed. Every known contact connected to Lyanna was investigated. The search produced nothing. Weeks passed. Still nothing. It was as though Lyanna had disappeared from the kingdom entirely. That alone irritated Kaylor. Few people could evade royal resources for long. Yet every report returned with the same answer. No trace, no sightings, no leads. 1 month became 3. 3 months became 6. The palace gradually adapted to life without her. New administrators were hired, departments reorganized, procedures rewritten. The chaos lessened, but it never vanished completely. Every system operated slower than before. Every solution required more people. Every task seemed unnecessarily complicated. No replacement lasted more than a few weeks before becoming overwhelmed. Eventually, even the council stopped pretending the situation was temporary. One evening, Kaylor reviewed another disappointing search report. No results. Again. He tossed the document onto his desk. Across from him, Commander Rowan watched carefully. "You've searched for her longer than most missing nobles. Kaelor's jaw tightened. Your point? Rowan shrugged. My point is that this seems personal. The room fell silent. Kaelor disliked the observation because it wasn't entirely wrong. At first, he had searched for practical reasons. The kingdom needed answers. The palace needed stability. That was what he told himself. But somewhere during the past 6 months, the reason had changed. Now he wanted to understand. Why had she left without a word? Why hadn't she asked for recognition? Why hadn't she confronted him? Most people would have. Lyanna hadn't. That silence troubled him more than anger ever could. A knock interrupted the conversation. A messenger entered, carrying fresh correspondence. Your Majesty. Kaelor accepted the reports. His eyes immediately caught a familiar name. Lyanna Evercrest. His posture straightened. Where did this come from? The messenger glanced at the document. A merchant caravan, sire. Kaelor opened the report quickly. A traveling merchant believed he had encountered a woman matching Lyanna's description near the western coast several months earlier. Not confirmed, not certain, just possible. Yet it was more information than anyone had found in half a year. Rowan noticed the change. Immediately. Is it her? I don't know. But for the first time in months, Kaelor felt something he hadn't expected. Hope. Small. Unwelcome. Persistent. The Alpha King folded the report carefully. If Lyanna truly lived near the western coast, then the search was finally over. The only remaining question was whether she would want to see him. And for reasons he couldn't fully explain, he wasn't confident about the answer. Nearly a year passed before the breakthrough arrived. It came from an unexpected source. An elderly servant who had worked in the palace longer than most nobles had been alive. One evening, she appeared outside Kaelor's study, carrying a small wooden box. My king. Kaelor looked up from his paperwork. What is it? We found this while clearing an old storage room. She placed the box on his desk. It belonged to Lady Lyanna. For a moment, neither moved. Then Kaelor opened it. Inside were hundreds of folded papers, notes, schedules, emergency plans, corrections, records. At first glance, they seemed ordinary. Then he began reading, and everything changed. Every page documented a problem that never reached the throne. A merchant dispute resolved before it became public. A diplomatic misunderstanding corrected before negotiations collapsed. Supply shortages fixed before villages suffered. Council conflicts settled before they erupted into political battles. Issue after issue, crisis after crisis, all quietly handled. All signed with the same neat handwriting. Lyanna's. Kaelor continued turning pages. The pile seemed endless. For years, he had believed the kingdom functioned smoothly because of capable leadership. Now, he was staring at evidence that much of that stability came from one woman working behind the scenes. A woman nobody celebrated. A woman nobody thanked. A woman he had called unimportant. His chest tightened. The servant remained silent while he read. Finally, he found a worn notebook at the bottom of the box. Unlike the others, it wasn't filled with schedules. It contained observations, personal reminders, thoughts written during long nights. Most were practical, until he reached the final page. There, in small, careful handwriting, Lyanna had written, "As long as the kingdom succeeds, nobody needs to know who fixed it." Kaelor froze. The sentence struck harder than any accusation, because it explained everything. She had never worked for recognition, never demanded rewards, never sought attention. She had simply cared enough to keep helping, again and again, while everyone around her took it for granted, including him. The room felt unusually quiet. The elderly servant finally spoke. She stayed because she loved this kingdom. Kaelor didn't answer immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the page. After a moment, he asked, "Did she ever complain? The servant smiled sadly. Not once. That somehow made it worse. If Lyanna had argued, he could defend himself. If she had demanded appreciation, he could claim misunderstanding. But she hadn't. She had simply left. And that made the truth impossible to avoid. Kaelor closed the notebook carefully. For the first time, he understood something he should have realized years earlier. The palace had never depended on Lyanna because of her position. It depended on her because of who she was. And by the time he finally recognized her value, she was already gone. 18 months after Lyanna's disappearance, the search finally ended. A merchant traveling through the western coast recognized her description. Dark hair, he reported. Gray eyes, quiet. Runs a small library near the sea. Kaelor listened without interrupting. The moment the merchant finished speaking, the Alpha King made his decision. He would go himself. No council meeting, no royal announcement, no ceremony, just answers. 2 days later, he arrived in a small coastal town overlooking the ocean. The place couldn't have been more different from the capital. No towering palace walls, no political intrigue, no nobles competing for influence. Only salt air, fishing boats, and the distant sound of waves. Kaelor followed the directions he'd been given until he reached a modest stone building near the shoreline. A wooden sign hung above the entrance. Coastal Community Library. Children ran in and out carrying books. Several adults chatted nearby. The scene looked peaceful, ordinary. Then he saw her. Lyanna stood outside the building, helping a young boy carry a stack of books. The child said something that made her laugh. A genuine laugh. The kind Kaelor had never heard inside the palace. For a moment, he simply watched. She looked different. Not physically. Healthier. Lighter. As though a weight she had carried for years had finally disappeared. The realization unsettled him. Because Lyanna wasn't struggling. She wasn't lonely. She wasn't waiting for someone to come find her. She had built an entirely new life. Without the palace, without the kingdom, without him. The boy ran back inside. Lyanna turned and immediately saw him. Their eyes met across the distance. Neither smiled, neither frowned. The silence between them felt strangely calm. After a moment, she walked toward him. You found me. Her voice carried no surprise, as though she had always known this day would eventually arrive. Kaelor nodded. Yes. A brief pause followed. The ocean wind moved between them. Then Lyanna asked the question he had spent months dreading. Why? Simple, direct, impossible. Kaelor opened his mouth. Nothing came out, because every explanation sounded inadequate. Finally, he settled on the truth. I needed to see you. Lyanna studied him quietly. And now that you've seen me? The question landed harder than expected, because Kaelor wasn't entirely sure. For months, he had imagined this meeting, imagined apologies, explanations, closure. Instead, standing here beside the ocean, all he could think about was how peaceful she looked, how happy, and how little that happiness seemed to involve him. For the first time, Kaelor realized something uncomfortable. Finding Lyanna had been the easy part. Convincing her he deserved this conversation might be impossible, and judging by the calm distance in her eyes, she already knew it. For several moments, neither spoke. The ocean rolled against the shore behind them. Children laughed somewhere inside the library. Life continued normally, as though this meeting wasn't carrying nearly 2 years of unfinished history. Finally, Lyanna broke the silence. You traveled a long way. Kaelor nodded. Yes. Why? The question came again. More firmly this time. She wasn't going to let him avoid it. Kaelor exhaled slowly. Because I was wrong. Lyanna's expression didn't change. About what? Everything. The answer sat heavily in his chest, but one truth mattered more than the others. You weren't nobody important. The words hung between them. For a moment, Leanna simply stared. Then she laughed softly, not with amusement, not with anger, with exhaustion. Kaylor immediately understood why. Those words should have been spoken years ago, not now, not after she had rebuilt her life, not after she had learned how to live without the palace, without him. You know what hurt the most? She asked quietly. Kaylor remained silent. It wasn't the statement. She looked directly at him. It was how easily it came out. The truth struck hard. Because she was right. He hadn't paused, hadn't considered, hadn't thought twice before saying it. At the time, it had felt insignificant. Now he understood exactly why it wasn't. Leanna folded her arms. For 5 years, I gave everything I had to that palace. Kaylor lowered his eyes briefly. I know. No. Her voice remained calm. You know now. Silence followed. Painfully honest silence. The kind neither could escape. After a moment, Leanna continued. Do you remember the Eastern famine? Kaylor frowned slightly. Of course. The relief routes failed 3 times before aid arrived. His expression shifted. She nodded. I fixed those routes. Another pause. The Southern trade dispute? I remember. I spent 2 weeks resolving it. One example became another, then another, and another. Not accusations, facts. Simple reminders of work that had always happened beyond his notice. Kaylor listened quietly. Each story added another piece to a picture he should have seen long ago. When she finally stopped speaking, neither seemed eager to fill the silence. The waves crashed gently below the cliffs. Then, Kaylor spoke. I'm sorry. The word sounded small, inadequate. Leanna's expression softened slightly. Not forgiveness, recognition. She believed he meant it. That was different. But sincerity didn't erase the past. Thank you, she said. Kaylor blinked. That wasn't the response he expected. Leanna glanced toward the library. Most people never apologize at all. The statement carried no bitterness, only experience. And somehow that made it hurt even more, because for the first time, Kaylor understood something he had spent months avoiding. An apology could acknowledge the damage, but it couldn't undo it. And some opportunities disappeared forever the moment you failed to value them. The conversation ended where the sea met the evening sky. Neither raised their voice, neither argued. The hardest truths rarely required shouting. They simply existed, and both of them knew it. For a long moment, Kaylor stood beside Leanna, watching the waves. The woman he had crossed the kingdom to find looked nothing like the person who left the palace. Not because she had changed, because she finally seemed free to be herself, without endless responsibilities, without constant expectations, without carrying everyone else's burdens. Kaylor realized something uncomfortable. The palace had needed Leanna, but Leanna had never needed the palace. Eventually, he spoke. I can apologize publicly. Leanna nodded. You should. I can correct the record. You should. I can make sure everyone knows what you did for the kingdom. Again, she nodded. You should. The answers came easily. Not because she expected those things, because they were simply the right things to do. Kaylor looked at her carefully, then asked the question that had followed him across the entire kingdom. Will you come back? Silence. The ocean breeze shifted around them. Far away, a bell rang from one of the fishing boats returning to shore. Leanna didn't hesitate. No. The answer arrived instantly. Clear, certain, final. Kaylor felt the impact immediately. Not because he hadn't considered the possibility, because part of him had hoped anyway. For years, Leanna had always stayed, always adapted, always sacrificed. Somewhere deep down, he had expected that pattern to continue. Instead, she shattered it with a single word. No. No negotiation, no compromise, no conditions. Just a choice. Her choice. And for perhaps the first time since meeting her, Kaylor truly understood what that meant. Lyanna belonged to herself, not to the palace, not to duty, not to him. The realization hurt, but it also felt deserved. After a moment, Lyanna smiled faintly. "I'm happy here." Kaylor looked toward the library. Children were gathered near the windows, reading books. Several townspeople waved when they noticed Lyanna. She waved back automatically, comfortably, like someone who belonged. The sight answered questions words never could. This wasn't an escape. It was a life, a real one she had built without permission from anyone, including a king. Kaylor exhaled slowly, then nodded. "I understand." Lyanna studied him for a moment, as if deciding whether she believed him. Finally, she smiled again, a little warmer this time. Good. The conversation could have ended there. Perhaps it should have. But as Kaylor turned toward the road leading back to the capital, one final truth settled heavily in his chest. He had come searching for Lyanna because he thought she was missing. Instead, he discovered that the only thing truly lost had been his chance to appreciate her while she was still standing beside him. And that was something no royal authority could ever recover.